Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is the latest episode of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. This past few episodes and the next few episodes, we're reading with the big boys, with the big guys, the big guns of literature. Sorry to make sexist comments like the big guys of literature, but the big shots, the best. This is the third to talk about Pale Fire, the most difficult, to some extent, of Nabokov's books, novels, and as almost as good. I still think the best books are Laughter in the Dark and Lolita, as I've argued in the past. But this is an amazing book. It's a beautiful book. It's very funny, and I'm going to try to spend about the same amount of time on the bulk of the book. So we talked already about the introduction, the foreword, and then we talked second about the poem itself of Pale Fire. So the text is presented as if it's an annotated edition of this poem by the dead poet John Shade, who's met a tragic end, and the commentary is the bulk of the book. And I'm trying to get you to think of these as three equal sections, because the joke of the book is that this great poem, and I still think a beautiful poem by an imaginary writer that Nabokov has invented, is as great and as wonderful to read on its own as this massively insane commentary that's put together by a crazy man who lives next door, who's obsessed with John Shade, who seems to think he's the king, the exiled king of Zembla, and who may simply be a nutty old man who's trying to get his male students to wrestle for him at his house, because he likes to watch his half-naked men wander around his house, and he's a particularly insidious and unpleasant man that nobody likes, and who looks pretty ridiculous. He's got a huge beard. He looks like the character of a ridiculous academic type. And this fellow, Charles Kinbote, who may be Charles X, who I forget what he thinks of himself as Charles X, the much beloved or something, as the king, if he was the king of this departed country, writes this huge, long commentary on the poem, which, like many commentaries we could probably find in the history of literary reply or literary scholarship, has nothing to do with the poem at all. And that's the joke, the first joke of the commentary. And then the second joke is that while this ridiculous fantasy is being elaborated by this crazy academic, we're actually starting to recognize correspondences between the commentary and the poem. The trick with Nabokov is that, as we've talked about in the past, is you read through one of his books, and when you get to the end, you think you understand the puzzle, but then you have to go back to the beginning, and every time you go back to the beginning, the puzzle gets a little more complicated. I think that's the best way I can think of to describe the reading of Nabokov. But the main thing we have to always remember is that the great pleasure of each reading of Nabokov is sequential. I'm going to keep arguing that. It's not metafiction. It's not scholarship to read Nabokov. It is a great story. So we've talked about how the beginning sets us up the basic conflict, which is between the critic and the poet. We then have the real meat of the book, which is the poem itself, this wonderful poem about a man at the end of his life who's lost his daughter and who is wondering about whether his daughter and himself will be reborn in any sort of way. So it's a speculation and a reflection on the possibility of being born again in some form. And it's a beautiful poem. And then we have the rebirth of the poem in this crazy commentary. It's a sequential commentary. So what the commentary is going to try to get you to do, because it's trying to play games with you, is to constantly refer you to different commentaries. Because basically the critic's job is to make sure you forget the poem. And every time he brings notes into his his commentary, he keeps referring you to other notes. So the worst way you can read Pale Fire is to keep reading the line numbers, going back to the line of the poem, or going back to other notes where he'll say, also discussed in notes X, Y, and Z. And it wants you to hopscotch through the book and go back and forth and go back to the poem and then go back into the comment and then compare a different set of notes, because it wants to take you away from the poem. That is what bad scholarship tends to do, and critical reception tends to do. Forgets the poem altogether. So we need to combat that, and the best way to combat that is to read the poem, this wonderful poem, first, and then to realize that as you're reading the commentary, you're reading a story about the poem and about the poem as a character and what has happened to that poem in subsequent days and weeks. All right? I'm not going to go into great detail with the commentary because there's so many jokes, so many allusions, so many reflections back and forth between the commentary and the poem that you can miss the story. So let me just remind you of what the story is of Pale Fire. Introduction, writer and critic meet. The poem is written, and the poem is about the loss of this daughter, Hazel. I keep forgetting her names. Hazel Shade. There are all these kind of poems, like the shade of a hazel tree or something. Huh? And shades and shadows are an important part of the book. So Hazel's tragic death, crashing through the ice of this frozen lake in the same way that the waxwing of this bird crashes into the window at the beginning of the poem and dies trying to move into this reflective world of the sky. Okay, so now the most interesting part is that what you'll see in the commentary is whenever we get to the meat of the poem, there's a couple of places, 174, whenever we get to the actual story of Hazel, Charles Kinbote always says, oh, and then he got onto this stuff about personal stuff. He starts talking about his daughter. That was really boring. And he skips past, every time the subject of the daughter shows up in the commentary, Kinbote goes, oh, we don't care about that. That's because Charles Kinbote believes that the poem is going to represent his own life. Okay, and as you read this commentary, which is very sequential, it's very chronological, Kinbote moves into the house next door of John Shade. He is enamored of John Shade's work, so he's a kind of a fan who wants to be friends with the poet. And he starts to follow him and go on walks with him. And in the course of these walks, he tells him a story, or he says he tells Shade a story, about a king of a far northern land called Zembla. Zembla, resemblance, semblance. Okay, so Zembla. And this king comes from, he tells about the long line of this king's family, and how the father of the king had died in a plane crash, and then the king himself, there's a revolution in Zembla, and the king who's gay, who's can't get married as much as everyone wants him to get married, but like Charles Kinbote prefers young men. He is taken over by the revolution. He's put in kind of state-sponsored prison in his home, and he must escape. And he escapes. Okay, so the story goes on. So we go back. The story is about John Shade meets Charles. They go on walks. As Charles is commenting on the poem, he tells the story that he told John Shade, which is of this king who had to flee Zembla. He flees to an underground. There's so many jokes, I don't want to go into all of them. He flees to an underground passage which leads to a theater, and everyone's dressed up, and he's helped to escape from Zembla by an actor named Odon. All right? And in the course of this escape, he comes to this town in Appalachia called New Y. Now that story is basically told in long narrative chunks. So once you stop thinking about the poem, because this story has nothing to do with the actual narrative of John Shade's poem, it's this kind of fantasy, probably, this probable fabrication. You're never really sure the first couple times you read this book, by this Charles Kinbote, king body, like the king. There's all sorts of puns on the name Kinbote. But the story is, again, as everything by Nabokov, beautifully written, physically realized, sensual. You feel like you're in these scenes. They're funny, they're imaginative, they're fantastic, and yet they're bound by realistic observation, physical observation. So this is really beautiful writing, but it's broken up by these occasional references to the poem. Usually when he refers back to the poem of Pale Fire, it's something like, well, what I told John Shade was about how I was escaping, but then John Shade went and talked about his poor daughter. We don't care about that. And then he moves on. So the commentary is really a kind of long, complicated forgetting of the poem. It's a long, very complicated forgetting, and it has its own story. And in the course of the story, Kinbote describes his fantasy, we think, of this revolution. Now remember, Nabokov comes from a fairly aristocratic family in St. Petersburg, and very well-off kid. And when the revolution comes, his feelings about working-class revolution for Nabokov is it's always bad. It's almost always bad. And his politics it's very peculiar to Nabokov. But he does feel that this kind of rabble that's taken over, this type of the democratic rabble, to Nabokov is almost as unpleasant as it is to one of his heroes like Edgar Allan Poe. But Nabokov is not as unpleasant as Poe. He's not as unpleasant at all. And I'll try to touch base on that. So we have this long story of fleeing from the revolution, trying to maintain this kind of aristocratic and sense of beauty in this kind of ideal, perfect, aristocratic world. And Kinbote ends up with John Shade, and then he imagines that the revolution sends someone to kill the king. And there's a man following him called Gradus, Gradus. There's lots of references and lots of grayness and gradations of gray, and the kind of colorlessness of this character who's coming after him, an unimaginative man, a bungler, like Nabokov sort of sees this kind of working class, unimaginative, revolutionary class. And he's a bungler who makes mistakes all the time. And in the course of the book, as the poem is being written, this man is coming to kill the king, who is Charles Kinbote. And when he does finally arrive near the end of the book, he comes to the house and he shoots John Shade instead and murders him. Okay? At which point, at the very end of the book, we start to realize how Kinbote got a copy of the poem, Pale Fire, which is he and John Shade were discussing the almost finished manuscript of Pale Fire, and as soon as John Shade dies, Kinbote grabs the manuscript and basically steals it so that he can control the way it's presented to the public, which is what Pale Fire is the presentation of the poem. The poem which is lost by the time you get to the end of the description of how it's presented. So, by the time you get to the end of the book, you kind of have to go back to the beginning. Maybe not that day, or maybe not that month, or that year, but eventually it's nagging you and you have to go back to the beginning of the book. The matter of the book and the emotional work of the book is sort of lost. It's sort of forgotten through this long commentary and the puzzles it presents to us. How much of it's real, how much fantasized. But you must, while you're reading it, you must focus on that chronological story as it goes through. Even though it's popping around and kind of going back and forth a bit in time, like most novels do to some extent, you must keep track of that if you want to enjoy Pale Fire, which you should. And then you can go back and start playing the game of Pale Fire, which many academics and critics like to do. Okay, so I'm not going to do too much more than that, because I think that sort of gives you what you need to know about Pale Fire in order to enjoy it. You definitely need to go back and you'll have to read it again, but you can enjoy it the first time through. There's one of the places I find most confusing the first time I read Pale Fire is when we start to make this shift to the story of Zembla, when Charles starts to go into it. He leaves John Shade and he goes back and tells the story he told John Shade, which is the history of the king fleeing Zembla. That's a little confusing. In the little period of time when there's the revolution and the king is put in prison, there's a few flashbacks in there. So just be careful around, I forget exactly, it's around 125, 150, that area. Just remember that's basically what's happening is he's going back and telling the story that he told John Shade while John Shade was writing the poem. Okay, so it's sequential. It's very much a novel. And Nabokov always knows how to do the basics of the novel. It's just he loves to complicate the hell out of them while he's at it. Now, I had a small passage I wanted to read here. This is from Speak Memory. This is Nabokov's autobiography. And again, one of the things that's most interesting about Nabokov, particularly in the later books, is he does start to become very interested in notions of eternity and a sort of transcendence of the world that he writes about so vividly. And he's interested in some sort of a unimaginable life beyond this one. It comes up again and again in his work. And that unimaginable life beyond this one is always tied in with the notion of telling stories and language and how language represents the world. His example is always how vividly we see a world when it's described to us in one sentence. If it's a beautiful sentence, we see a whole world. And he's trying to get to that sense of multiplicity in language and in storytelling, which this book is nothing but multiplicity and reflections and infinite reflections. There's a wonderful little passage in here, just came across today. The beginning, he says, "How small the cosmos! A kangaroo's pouch would hold it. How paltry and puny in comparison to human consciousness, to a single individual recollection and its expression in words." I'm going to type that up and put that at the bottom of this lecture today. The idea that the universe itself seems puny in comparison to the expression of it. And there's something magical and beautiful about that idea that comes through in so much of Nabokov's writing. So whatever you think about him, and he's a very interesting character. One last point I wanted to make about Nabokov. You can't read Nabokov without thinking about Edgar Allan Poe. He loved Poe, so he's constantly referring to Poe. And his interest in Poe was a great hoaxer in a cruel way. Poe loved to hoax the audience because he considered them kind of stupid. And it's been my mistake, to sometimes equate that idea with Nabokov, that he's often hoaxing us. He's trying to fool us. And you never feel cheated by Nabokov. You never feel like you're the object of a joke, though it's possible sometimes to think you are. And I want to just leave with one little story that Nabokov comes up with in one of his many interviews, and he compares writing novels to chess problems. A chess problem that's written by a chess master to be figured out by the player of the game. So the game creator, if I was writing the puzzle, and the game player. And he says that that's not a hoax. He's not trying, the game, when you put together a chess problem or you put together a piece of fiction, you aren't trying to fool the reader. You're rather working with them on an equal playing field. You're trying to establish a puzzle that will entertain them and draw them in and look at the infinite possibilities of replying to that problem and enjoy it. So it's a way of meeting between the writer and the reader. And I think that you do feel that way when you read Nabokov. And he deserves, but you have to be a little patient, really read it sequentially, be a little careful when we kind of go into this long fantasy of Kinbote about Zembla. But that's what we're going into. He's pretending that Charles, the King Charles, is somebody else, though you know it's probably him. And there's a little kind of shift into that narrative of the king's flight and the pursuit of the king by Gratus, the assassin, who at the end of Pale Fire is quite possibly a madman who's escaped from an asylum, who's come there to kill the inhabitant of Kinbote's house, because Kinbote's renting a house from some old crazy judge. That's probably what's going on. So anyway, there's a lot of ways of reading it, but read that main story. You should really enjoy that story, and then go back. All right? I'm going to have one more little lecture on this wonderful book.